Hello, my name is John Smeaton, and on behalf of Voice of the Family, I welcome you to the Family and Life Academy and to the third lesson in our course on natural law. The course is written and presented by Dr. Joseph Shaw, a philosopher and author. Having explored the origins of the natural law tradition in his first lesson, Dr. Shaw went on in his second lesson to discuss the importance of Roman legal theory in the intellectual development of the Middle Ages and of the Aristotelian revival pioneered by St. Albert the Great and St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, delving further into how Aristotle's ideas are best interpreted in the light of Christian tradition. Both these lessons are available for you to watch again on the Family and Life Academy website at whatever time suits you best. The subject of Dr. Shaw's third lesson is dispositions and precepts. At the end of the lesson, Dr. Shaw will answer any questions you may have about natural law, which you can put in the chat window. And so now I hand over the stage to Dr. Shaw.
Thank you very much. So this is our third lecture on dispositions and precepts. In the last lecture, excuse me, I introduced Aquinas' understanding of natural law in terms of dispositions. The focus on dispositions or virtues is characteristic of Aristotle, but Aquinas had to add much from the Christian and specifically Augustinian tradition to Aristotle's ideas in order to complete the picture. And this has included the concept of the beatific vision as the end God desires for us as rational creatures. Aristotle's focus on dispositions is often contrasted with a focus on rules. Historians of ethics talk of the virtue-based ethics of the ancient world, by which they mostly mean Greece of the 4th century BC, and the rule-based ethics characteristic of the modern world, by which they mean Europe and regions of European culture from the 17th century onwards. The 2 millennia period in between is usually neglected. In any case, Aristotle's concern with virtues is related to his interest in moral education and development and character. In the Christian context, his approach lends itself to an interest in spirituality. The focus on rules, by contrast, leads to a moral theory well adapted to deal with matters related to law, obligation, duty, and punishment. In this lecture, I will show how Aquinas managed to combine the two approaches. St. Thomas Aquinas united in his work two great traditions, the Aristotelian and the Augustinian. In previous presentations, I have explained how those traditions were related. Both shared the idea that there is in all rational agents a fundamental tendency to seek the ultimate human good, however that is to be understood. Both responded to skepticism about morality by saying that doing the right thing is good for the agent. It is for the agent's own good, for his flourishing or perfection. Nevertheless, they differed in a fundamental way. The Aristotelian tradition, like that of Plato, focused on the virtues, and the Augustinian tradition, combining the Stoic terminology of the natural law with the biblical tradition, focused on the concept of law. This difference is not simply one of emphasis, it is fundamental to how an ethical theory works. Virtue-based ethical theory tells us what to do by reference to its analysis of virtues, which are the component parts of the character of the good or ideal agent. If we are in perplexity about whether to denounce a friend's shady dealings to the police, for example, it will point us to the virtues of friendship and justice, and if necessary, to the overarching virtue of prudence or practical wisdom. A rule-based ethical theory, by contrast, tells us what to do by reference to rules, which pick out action types as required or forbidden in certain circumstances, or perhaps always. In a case of perplexity, it will point us towards the relevant rules, such as the principle of obedience to the law and the obligations connected with friendship, and if necessary, to the principles which guide us in dealing with conflicts between the rules, such as considerations of the greatest good or the priority of public justice over private concerns. The conclusions of a rule-based theory will be couched in terms of right and wrong, our obligations, duties, and perhaps rights. These are deontic concepts. What is forbidden by the rules is wrong, contrary to duty. When we do those actions, we are failing to fulfill our obligations. What is not forbidden by the rules is right, permissible, in accordance with our obligation. If we break the rules, we are subject to criticism, blame, and perhaps punishment. If we keep them, we are not. The rules establish a minimum standard of behavior, a threshold. Once that threshold is reached, we have fulfilled our moral obligations and can turn our attention to other matters. Or alternatively, we can do good actions which over-fulfill our obligations, for which we should receive special praise. The Catholic tradition calls these actions which go beyond what we are obliged to do supererogation. The conclusions of a virtue-based theory, on the other hand, will be couched in terms not of right and wrong, but of good and bad. Actions are described as noble and beautiful, or base and ugly. These are not deontic concepts, but evaluative concepts. We are directed not towards a minimum standard, but towards the ideal action, the perfect action, situated between the less perfect actions which differ from it in different directions, by excess or by defect. The ideal action is thus naturally described as a mean between opposite vices, courage between cowardice and rashness. In this context, the notion of supererogation doesn't make sense. Going beyond the courageous action, for example, is the error of rashness. The difference between the two approaches to ethics can be illustrated by their dominant metaphors. Plato talked about tuning a lyre, a stringed musical instrument, Aristotle of an archer shooting at a target. These images express the idea of the best possible action, not too high, not too low, just right. This might be a very demanding action, or it might not be terribly demanding. The point about it is that it is a matter of acute judgment by the agent. The ideal agent, the virtuous man, knows exactly what present to give his second cousin on the occasion of his 12th wedding anniversary, not showy and vulgar, not skimpy and mean, the present that befits the occasion. Morality is not necessarily a matter of heroic effort, though it may involve this sometimes. It is a matter of balance, of taste. This is a morality for gentlemen, educated, leisured, and independent, of the kind Aristotle thought alone capable of living the best life. The dominant metaphor for the morality of rules is debt, of what we owe each other. St. Matthew the Evangelist is particularly fond of this metaphor. In his version of the Lord's Prayer, we ask God to forgive us our debts, chapter 6, verse 12, indebted servants and day labourers looking forward to their wages populate his parables, chapter 18, 21, chapter 21 and following. Morality can be analysed, at least in large part, as a series of debts which must be paid. One lesson of the parable of the unforgiving debtor is the contrast between the relatively trivial debts we owe each other as humans and the crushing debt we owe to God, which ultimately can only be paid with the currency of the blood of our Lord Jesus Christ shed on the cross. It is not a matter of balance, but of a bare minimum, with the sunlit uplands of good actions stretching beyond it. Straying beyond the Gospel of Matthew, we hear in the New Testament that God loves a cheerful giver. That's 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 7. And that we will be repaid for our generosity, and I quote, good measure and pressed down and shaken together and running over shall be given into your bosom. For with the same measure that you shall meet withal, it shall be measured to you again. That's Luke 6:38. This is a morality, on the one hand, of the bean-counting merchant, the tax collector, the mercenary, and the day labourer, and on the other hand, of the ascetic, the crusader, and the martyr, who expend their whole selves in God's service. Can these two expressions of morality be combined? To an extent, each acknowledges the claims of both kinds of moral requirement. The virtue of justice, Aristotle tells us, is the virtue of giving each man his due. Virtues may be means between excess and defect, but Aristotle acknowledges that one of the two opposed vices is often more opposed to the virtue than the other one. Justice is therefore more opposed to defect, giving less than is due, than to excess, giving more than is due. Similarly, courage is more opposed to cowardice than to rashness. In this way, the official symmetry of Aristotle's system makes a kind of compromise with a rule-based approach, which insists on a minimum and encourages the over-fulfillment of obligations. Again, Aristotle allows that some action types, such as matricide, are always wrong. Effectively, there are rules against them. On the other hand, rule-based morality must acknowledge the importance of virtues. Although moral rules picking out action types may seem much clearer than the judgment of the virtuous man, rules are not self-interpreting and don't give agents the power to carry them out. It is easy to say, do not kill, for example, but it is far from clear what that means in cases of risking some people's lives in order to safeguard others, to indicate just one set of examples. A proper understanding of the rules is possible only if you have the virtues of wisdom and prudence. Again, it is one thing to know what to do and another thing to be able to do it. We also need a range of virtues from courage to temperance. Again, if we find ourselves obliged to support a family or to defend our nation in war, we will need the more mundane skills necessary to earn money or fire a gun. Again, the idea of a minimum requirement with open-ended possibilities of over-fulfillment of one's obligation creates dangers of self-defeating excesses, like the fasting of St. Bernard, which threatened to ruin his health. These excesses must be kept in check with moderation, prudence, and discretion. This means that supererogation, the praiseworthy going beyond the minimum required, must often in practice be tempered by the idea of the ideal action, not too much and not too little. What I have just described, however, is a matter of the two approaches borrowing from each other. They are still radically different, one focused on rules and obligation, the other focused on virtues and character. In modern ethical theory, they are regarded as incompatible. For a complete integration of the two approaches, we would need to be able to answer the question of how exactly virtues relate to obligations. It is this which is achieved by St. Thomas Aquinas. Rule-based moral theories do not need to have an aim as such. They can simply exist to tell us what is right and wrong. If they do have a purpose, it may be to minimize conflict within a community, setting standards of behavior which are as easy as possible to understand and enforce, and making things as predictable as possible, minimizing conflict. The moral system implied by the scriptures and elaborated by the church, however, is not like that. It does not exist simply to tell us our duty or to help us rub along with each other. It also has the purpose of getting us to heaven. This gives it something of fundamental importance in common with the virtue ethics. The virtues are not designed primarily to pick out for us what is right just because we want to know what is right, or to facilitate social life. They are about helping us flourish, which is to say, to become good people, bringing us closer to the ideal agent, the virtuous man. The individual virtues are the component parts of the ideal character. The fact that Christian ethics is ultimately concerned with each agent's moral perfection explains why, despite the use of rules as a guide to moral behavior, There is such emphasis in Scripture and in moral theology on personal development, spiritual practices, and the virtues. Just think of the material on forgiveness, repentance, and penance. What, though, is the purpose of the rules themselves? How exactly do they help? As already noted, Aristotle does not think it necessary to have rules to guide people towards moral perfection. They must rather learn by example, experience, and literary and philosophical treatments of the virtues, including his own, what the virtues mean in different situations, until they are habitually able to exercise the carefully honed judgment of the virtuous man. The moral rules we find in Scripture and in the teaching of the Church pick out for us action types which are especially offensive to God, or equivalently are gravely wrong. The importance of identifying these action types is not just to nudge us towards developing the virtues which oppose them, but to warn us of actions which are incompatible with reaching our goal. As St. Paul wrote to the Corinthians, this is 1 Corinthians chapter 6, 9 to 10, I quote, "Know you not that the unjust shall not possess the kingdom of God? Do not err, neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor the effeminate, nor liars with mankind, nor thieves, nor covetous, nor drunkards, nor railers, nor extortioners shall possess the kingdom of God." Unquote. Although St. Paul refers here to categories of people, these people are picked out by action types. The problem lies with fornication, idol worship, adultery, and so on. These actions are gravely wrong, and so, to use a familiar distinction, mortal sins, if done deliberately, with knowledge of their seriousness and with full consent. Mortal sins drive out sanctifying grace from our souls, break our friendship with God, and, unless repented, will send us to hell. They are appropriately picked up by rules rather than in terms of vices for two reasons. First, it is the deliberate commission of these actions which is the point, regardless of the previous state of the agent's character. It doesn't matter how strong in virtue someone is, one act of fornication is enough to strip him of God's friendship. Secondly, they are linked to the concept of punishment. We are in the realm here of minimum standards, right and wrong, duty and obligation. At the same time, rules are critical to the development of the virtues and to the agent's perfection. The line which the rule picks out, the line between the mortal sin and some lesser sin, is important because it is as you cross that line that you lose sanctifying grace and God's friendship and incur the penalty of eternal punishment. This can be so even if it is not always clear to the agent exactly where the line is. The line must be somewhere. There must be a difference between mortal and venial sin because there is a difference between temporal punishment, the kind that comes to an end and can be suffered in this life and in purgatory, and the eternal punishment of hell. Venial sin is simply the kind of sin which does not incur eternal punishment. Mortal sin is the kind that does. To bring back the distinction set out in the last lecture, this difference is a good deal clearer and more important in relation to our supernatural end than it is to our natural end. For a bad non-baptized agent in a state of original sin, who is not in friendship with God, the difference between a mortal sin and a venial sin is really just one of the degree of offense it causes God. You can't lose God's friendship if you don't have it in the first place. Fallen humans need to be established in friendship with God through baptism. The relationship between the ultimate ideal of the moral life as a state of personal perfection and a set of rules which set a minimum standard of behavior is implicit in biblical ethics, and it becomes increasingly explicit as moral theology and pastoral practice develop in the era of the Church. A generation before Aquinas, in 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council confirmed the obligation to go to confession at least once a year. This obligation is still enforced today on Catholics, and we must confess all our mortal sins by species and number. The point of this is to cleanse our souls of those sins which directly conflict with our salvation. The practice of confession focused attention on rules and action types, as an understanding of these now needed to be inculcated into the entire Catholic population. This stimulated an industry of composing and teaching catechism and examinations of conscience. In order to incorporate Aristotle's ethical thinking, which directs us to acquire the virtues of the ideal agent, into an Augustinian system, which tells us to keep certain rules in order to attain heaven, Aquinas affirmed that the deliberate violation of fundamental precepts of natural law is incompatible with a state of virtue, correctly understood as friendship with God. Keeping the rules, and thereby avoiding mortal sin, is a necessary condition of progress towards the moral goal. The combination of virtue-focused and rule-focused elements in Thomist moral theology leaves a number of issues essentially undecided. As explained earlier, virtue ethics sees the best action as a mean between excess and defect. By contrast, rule-based ethical theories present us with a minimum standard of good action, with better options going beyond it into the realms of supererogation. Aquinas was happy with both approaches, of the best action as a mean and of supererogation. In practice, he uses one or the other way of talking, according to what seems most appropriate to the context. As already indicated, the two systems in practice have to make some concession to the other's way of talking. A virtue ethicist has to admit that excess in generosity or courage is not really blameworthy and need not be self-aggrandizing or vulgar, but actually can be rather nice. A rules-based theorist must admit that the possibilities of good action going beyond the morally required can sometimes peak in an ideal, praiseworthy action. And then, if you try to go beyond that, start being imprudent, impractical, or counterproductive. In different situations, it may be more useful to emphasize the one or the other. Insofar as the morality of the natural law lends itself to rules, more needs to be said about how these work. In a previous talk, I noted that, in passing, that a deontological ethical theory, a morality of rules, must have a way of preventing rules from conflicting or resolving conflicts. Virtues also look as though they could conflict, justice with friendship, temperance with liberality, and so on. The virtue theorist tends to say that the solution lies in the way the virtues themselves are understood. True friendship does not require us to contravene justice for a friend, for example. In a similar way, on the face of it, moral rules might seem to clash, and this must be addressed. Thus, first, honouring one's parents might clash with any of the other commandments if parents told a child to break one of them. Secondly, if the command to honour parents is understood, as it is, to include one's obligations towards all kinds of legitimate authority, including those of church and state, then these different sources of authority might give one conflicting commands. On the first point, the tradition tells us that one should not obey people in authority when they command us to commit sin. Their commands, therefore, lack force inasmuch as they contravene other obligations. I'll return to the question of the role of authority in a later talk. On the second point, it will be necessary not only to assign different authorities different spheres in which to exercise authority, but also to rank authorities within a particular sphere in a hierarchy. As Augustine put it, one should obey the emperor in preference to a provincial governor, should they contradict each other. In this way, understanding how the rules work is subject to discussion and clarification in rather the same way as understanding the virtues. A great deal of practical wisdom is contained in discussions of how rules interact or are limited by general principles, which are found in moral theology and works intended for the use of confessors. For the rest of this lecture, I want to examine some of these, but I will have time only for some of the more fundamental issues. Some critics of traditional rule-based moral theories say that the rules based on action descriptions will conflict not only with each other, but with themselves. Take the rule against killing the innocent. An agent can knowingly contribute to, that is, be a causal factor in, the deaths of innocent people in many different ways. So there can be cases where nothing an agent can do will fail to contribute to such a death. Thus, for example, if we had to decide whether to take the last consignment of food aid to one village of starving people or another village of starving people, whichever way the decision goes, the food lorries driving away from the doomed village and towards the other one will be the key causal factor in the deaths of its inhabitants, at least in the immediate sense, and we may know this in advance with a high degree of certainty. A different kind of example is given by St. Augustine. He posed the case of a persecutor who demanded that an imprisoned Christian perform an act of worship towards an image of the emperor, threatening that if this were not done, the persecutor would harm or kill innocent people. The Christian, it might be said, has the power to bring about the deaths of these innocent people or to save them. He holds, we might say, the causal levers in his hands. This kind of argument is made by people who think that the best approach to morality is simply to try to bring about the best possible end result, that is, utilitarianism or consequentialism. I will consider this theory in more detail in a later lecture. What St. Augustine says is that the two ways in which the imprisoned Christian can influence events do not have the same moral significance. Personally and deliberately doing something in order to achieve some result is not the same as failing to prevent a blackmailer from doing something. This much may seem obvious, but the way in which the two differ is of the utmost importance. It is not that Augustine thinks that one is always morally okay if one remains impassive and refuses to move. We are often obliged to move in order to help people. Failing to move can even be a signal that one wants to bring something about. It can represent a tacit consent to something. Instead of invoking a distinction between doing and allowing, based on whether the agent is moving his body or not, Augustine makes use of a concept developed by the Stoics of consent. The Stoics were troubled by the fact that, despite thinking officially that nothing mattered very much if one retained one's virtue, they still became upset or overjoyed when bad or good things happened to them, if they were bereaved or if they had some stroke of good fortune. They developed a way around the problem by saying that a Stoic, even if he can't help having the emotion, can at least not consent to it. What they meant is about one's attitude to the emotion. A good Stoic does not endorse it. He feels the sorrow or the joy, but knows it is not justified. Nothing really bad or good has happened. Augustine uses this idea to express the attitude of the prisoner who is being blackmailed. If he performed the act of worship demanded, this might just be tossing a pinch of incense onto a brazier burning in front of a statue of the emperor. It would be conscious and deliberate. It would be something the Christian consented to, notwithstanding the pressure he might be under. If he refused and the persecutor carried out his threat toward innocent people, it would not be something he consented to. He would, internally at least, stand aloof from it. It would be natural for us to say that if the persecutor killed innocent people in carrying out his threat, this is not an action of the imprisoned Christian. It is not something he does. We have to be careful about this way of talking, however. Shakespeare's Macbeth, having arranged Banquo's assassination, says to Banquo's ghost, Thou canst not say, I did it. Never shake thy gory locks at me. He is presumably hoping that because he did not personally carry out the murder, he can't be blamed for it. But he arranged it. It took place because of efforts he had made to ensure it took place. In Augustine's terminology, he consented to it. In a narrow sense, it was not his action, it was the action of the hired murderers. In a broader sense, it is something he did. He had Banquo killed. One might use the archaic expression, he suffered it to be done. Returning to the argument that the prohibition on killing the innocent contradicts itself because it may be necessary to kill the innocent in order to stop more innocent people being killed, Augustine provides a solution. We should never consent to killing the innocent, even in order to stop a killing of the innocent to which we do not consent. We consent to the killing of the innocent when we plan or arrange it, when we deliberately bring it about for our own ends. If someone threatened to kill the innocent unless we did something or other and we refused to do it, then the subsequent killing does not have the same moral significance for us as agents as if we brought it about deliberately. By refusing to perform what the blackmailer demands, we do not break the rule against killing the innocent, though, of course, the blackmailer does break it. The prospect of these deaths does not justify our killing the innocent with consent, even if that seems to be a way to minimize the total number of innocents who are killed. This does not mean that we should be morally indifferent to the killing of the innocent or anything else bad which we do not carry out ourselves or to which we do not consent. Exactly what we need to do about this aspect of the situation is something to which I will return. The problem of rules contradicting themselves is not limited to the fifth commandment, thou shalt not kill. The same argument and the same response can be applied to all of them. I must not blaspheme, lie, steal, or commit adultery, to stop other people's blasphemies, lies, thefts, or adulteries, or any other combination of them. This point was made explicit by Peter Abelard, a philosopher of the generation before Aquinas, when he suggested that all the 10 commandments must be understood in the sense, I must not consent to lie, steal, kill, and so on, and not in the sense, I must not bring about lies, thefts, and murders. On the second interpretation, the best we could do would be to minimize the number of lies, thefts, and murders in which we are a causal factor, which is to say, in which we have any influence. This would be a very different approach to keeping the 10 Commandments completely alien to the normal way of understanding them. St. Thomas Aquinas developed these ideas. I have already noted that after the Fourth Lateran Council, Catholics had to confess their mortal sins by species and number. Aquinas considered the question of what gives the species of an action, of how we categorize actions. To do this, he used a series of closely related ideas: the object, the end, and the intention. The end of an action explains why you are doing it. When we see someone doing something and ask, what is he doing? We usually want to know why he is doing whatever he is doing, why this person is digging in the ground, say. Is he planting potatoes, mending a water main, or looking for treasure? To ask, what is he doing, is really to ask what the agent is trying to do, or what hoped for end result is motivating him to act. Actions come in chains. We get a bus to catch a train, to get to town, to go to work, to earn some money, to buy some food, to satisfy our bodily needs. Each of these actions has an object which is involved in the agent's practical reasoning as steps to get the ultimate objective. Most of them are desired only instrumentally as means to a further end. I'm not particularly crazy about traveling on buses in the rush hour, but it gets me to where I need to go. Only the very last objects of our chains of action are desired for their own sake, meeting my bodily needs to keep alive, say. Wanting something only instrumentally rather than desiring it for its own sake does not excuse us if it is morally wrong. Suppose a man gets the bus, to catch the train, to carry out an assassination, to get some money, to buy food for his family. The assassination in the middle of that chain of action is still one of his ends and is willed by him. The goal of each and every one of his actions is intended by the agent, and some rules typically pick out action types in terms of, and moral rules typically pick out action types in terms of intentions. If we must not kill or steal or commit adultery, we must not intend a killing, a theft, or an adultery at any point in a chain of action. It is beside the point for the agent to say he didn't really want to do it, or that it wasn't the ultimate motivation for his action. Looking at actions in this way means that we are equally to blame if we deliberately bring something about by silence or by omission. If I want to inherit my young nephew's money and see him slip in the bath, knock himself out, and sink under the water, I can bring about my plan that he die without moving a muscle. My non-intervention is chosen by me with a particular end in view, his death. I intend his death no less than if I had held his head under the water by force. On the other hand, I may bring things about without intending to, as a side effect of actions which have other aims. I use up the oxygen in a submarine. I wear out the leather of my shoes. I use up the fuel in my car. Usually, these sorts of things are side effects of actions which have different intentions. Having said that, it is important to keep in mind that any of these things could be an aim of my action. Whether talking is my object and using up the submarine's oxygen is a side effect, or talking is the means I have chosen to use up the oxygen faster, is up to me. What I intend is chosen by me when I choose what to do, since in choosing what to do, I'm responding to reasons for action. If I talk because I have some reason to use up the oxygen, I'm intending to use up the oxygen. If I talk because I have something urgent to say, then that is my intention, and the use of the oxygen is a side effect. It may not be easy to tell from outside, but it is a real difference. It is a question of my reasons for action, of why I do what I do. Thus, I may have a reason for using up the oxygen. I may want to test the submarine system for detecting oxygen levels, for example. Then again, I may be acutely conscious that I'm using up a dwindling supply of oxygen, but desperately need to talk in order to get a suicidal terrorist to open a spare oxygen tank. Or I may be recklessly indifferent to the oxygen levels, or I may be indifferent because I have checked and there is plenty of oxygen and it does not matter. These different possibilities represent different possible stories about the facts and my reasons for action. The commands not to kill, steal, and so on are rules not to intend any of these things. A different kind of moral category is needed to capture the importance of bringing about bad results when we do not intend them. A grave sin is a deliberate doing of an action of a particular action type: killing, stealing, adultery, idolatry, and so on. As just described, these action types are defined by reference to the goal or intention of the agent in doing the action: a death, a loss of property by someone, a sexual act outside marriage. The action description does not include actions which bring about those upshots, a death, a theft, if that is not the goal or intention of the agent in doing the action. For example, if someone were to write a pamphlet blaming corn dealers for high food prices, it might inspire some readers of the pamphlet to burn down a corn dealer's house with a corn dealer inside it. If that were the result the writer was trying to bring about, if that was the intention of his action, then he is guilty of the sin of killing the innocent, even though he did not carry out the attack with his own hands. If, on the other hand, it was not a predictable outcome and the writer had no idea that such a thing would happen, then he is not. More complicated are the middle cases in which the writer either thinks violence is likely to result from his pamphlet or does not consider the danger at all. In legal language, the first is negligence and the second is recklessness. Unreasonable risk-taking behaviour, such as not maintaining the brakes on one's car or driving too fast around a blind corner, might be negligent or reckless, depending on the attitude of the agent. Is it a calculated risk or a disregard for risk? But typically, neglected brakes is negligent and dangerous driving is reckless. These are ways in which an agent can be related to a bad upshot, which is less serious than intending it, but is not without blame. Catholic moral theology uses different terms to divide up the possible actions in a slightly different way. This area of morality is called cooperation with evil. There are two kinds of cooperation: formal cooperation, in which the bad result is intended, and material cooperation, when it is not. With formal cooperation, the agent takes on the full guilt of intending the evil. Material cooperation, on the other hand, should be avoided when possible, but sometimes avoidance is not possible, and sometimes the cost of avoiding it may be disproportionate. In those cases, material cooperation is morally justified. Catholic examinations of conscience sometimes include a list of 9 ways to partake in another's sin, which is to say, 9 types of cooperation with evil. And I quote, by counsel, by command, by consent, by provocation, by praise or flattery, by concealment, by partaking, by silence, by defence of the ill done. Unquote. These kinds of cooperation are very reminiscent of the legal concept of being an accessory to a crime, whether before or after the fact. In Catholic terminology, any of these forms of cooperation can be formal or material. One might do them out of fear, for example, which would be material cooperation, or because we want the evil to succeed, which would be formal. Similarly, scandal in Catholic moral theology is acting in such a way to cause another person to sin, and can be formal or material. As already noted, the Catholic tradition tells us that material cooperation with evil is not always wrong. This is not because we want to have an easy life, but because a moral theory which forbade all cooperation with evil would contradict itself. To return to an earlier example, driving a lorry full of food aid away from a village of starving people, or steering a lifeboat away from a group of drowning shipwrecked victims, are actions which bring about deaths, and may do so with the full knowledge of the agent. If these deaths are not intended, the agent's involvement is material, not formal. These actions may be justified. Indeed, they may be obligatory if they are necessary to save a larger number of people. On the other hand, the prospect of saving a larger number of people can never justify doing an action with the intention of killing the innocent, however few they may be. The business of working out test cases, real or imaginary, in relation to the above principles is something of a cottage industry in Catholic moral theology called casuistry. In order to work out what is allowed and what is not, you need a list of actions which are intrinsically evil, which can be never rightly willed. These include killing the innocent, apostasy, and adultery. These are clear enough, but there is some room for debate on either other items. What exactly constitutes lying, for example? The next thing you need is a clear understanding of what it is to intend an action of one of these types. There is some debate about this as well, but the common sense understanding of intention is what we are concerned with. You intend something if you are trying to bring it about, if it is the object of your practical reasoning or gives you a reason for action. It should be noted that there can be multiple intentions in an action, and intentions may not be what they seem. When it comes to justifying material cooperation in evil, it is a matter of the cost which it would be right to pay to avoid cooperation. Material cooperation can be close, like handing ammunition to a serial killer, not because you want him to kill anyone, but just for the money, or remote, like paying taxes which pay for abortions. The tradition is very firm on formal cooperation. If you are trying to bring about something which is a mortal sin, you are committing a mortal sin yourself. Remote material cooperation is quite different. An example from one of the old manuals of moral theology is a typesetter asked to set the type on a pornographic novel. If quitting the job will lead to his family starving, he should not quit the job. He should look for something else first, and only then leave the tainted job. This is remote material cooperation. Close material cooperation is more serious. The rule of thumb is that one should avoid even remote material cooperation if one can do so without, and I quote, grave inconvenience, unquote. The tradition has a huge amount of material on this, from the writings of great moral theologians to textbooks for seminarians and handbooks for confessors. But when we come down to concrete cases of how much inconvenience should be endured to avoid how close cooperation, it is more a matter of common sense and balance than a mathematical proof. The Catholic natural law tradition will give you a lot more help than most moral theories, but there always remains, to some degree, the necessity of exercising judgment. In this lecture, I have explored the relationship between dispositions or virtues with rules and laws. In Aquinas' moral theory, Aquinas' Christian theological roots commit him to a view of the moral life as leading towards an ultimate goal, which is what Aristotle thought, even if he had a different understanding of what the ultimate goal is. But the Christian tradition includes a use for rules which differs from the Aristotelian tradition, fundamental moral principles which prevent us from doing things incompatible with attaining salvation. To understand how these rules work, I have set out some key distinctions relating to intention, side effects, negligence, and scandal. In the next lecture, I will look at a different kind of law altogether, human law, the law created by men to govern human societies.
Thank you, Dr. Shaw. So, we do have a few questions for you, and the first question, very down to earth, can you recommend any good books or manuals of moral theology, especially for the laity?
Go to your second-hand Catholic bookshop. There are tons of these. And depending on how good your Latin is, you can read it in Latin. The older ones are in Latin. The less old ones are in the vernacular language, including English, with the naughty bits in Latin, which is a nice stimulus to one's learning that sacred language. You can read all about terrible things that people do with animals, for example, only in Latin language. But standard ones are a chap called Pruma, with a double M, and Henry Davies, IES. Henry Davies is a moral and pastoral theology in 4 not very big volumes. They are technical. There's a consistent use of technical language, and they are, they have their peculiarities. But if you want to see what the kind of things that they were saying back in the right up until the 60s, then yeah, you can read them. There are more up-to-date things, but they tend to be more specialist. So things about bioethics, for example, there's lots of good work going on there, but it's also technical and not doesn't cover the whole range of issues.
Yeah. Just a supplementary there of my own, Dr. Shaw. Are these books easily available?
Yeah, yeah, you can get them. You look at ABE books, for example, which links up all the secondhand bookshops. Then yeah, you'll find them.
Right, thank you. Right, well, the next question is this. You mentioned that moral theories must have a built-in mechanism for dealing with conflicting virtues or rules. Isn't this the aim of casuistry?
Well, casuistry does address itself to those some of those issues, but casuistry is about cases which are difficult. If we didn't have any mechanism for dealing with conflicts between rules, then everything would be difficult. So why am I sitting here and not earning money in order to give it to famine relief? Because surely there's an obligation for me to make some contribution to the relief of my fellow human beings, and aren't I breaking that by doing some teaching, or indeed sleeping, or putting my clothes on, or anything else? Well, there's got to be something universal in the moral theory which allows you to understand when rules apply, and there are always going to be more difficult cases. But what I was referring to was the very fundamental thing. So in this case, for example, the obligation of aid is a relatively weak obligation compared to the negative obligations not to kill. So that's a general principle, and so on and so forth. So those sorts of things you have to get them in first before you start worrying about difficult cases.
Thank you. And then I've got this further question. Could an act of apostasy, like worshipping an image of the emperor, be said to be only material cooperation with evil if one acted out of fear?
Yes. So, well, no. And I'll explain why. So, if you, well, as happened in the Second World War, this chap who was known as Lord Hawthorne did broadcasts for the Germans, and after the war, he said that he had done it out of fear, not in order to assist the enemy. If he'd done it in order to assist the enemy, that would be treason. If he'd done it knowing that it assists the enemy but out of fear, that's a different kind of question. Now, somebody pointed out in his trial that he could make the same argument if he'd done it for a packet of cigarettes. But that is true. I mean, it may sound silly, but that is actually true. There's still a difference between doing something for a packet of cigarettes and doing it with the intention that this bad thing succeed. Now, in the case of worshipping the emperor, unfortunately, you are doing it yourself. The act which is forbidden by the rule is the act of worshipping the emperor. You are bringing that about by our own decision. Yes, you are motivated by a desire to avoid being tortured or whatever it might be. But the motivation of the action is not the point. It is, what are you actually performing? You are directly breaking the commandment not to, well, the first commandment.
Thank you. And now another question, quite a longish one. Do you think that the deontological approach to ethics is less attractive than the evaluative approach, because the latter is based on virtue, which we naturally find admirable? On the other hand, the deontological approach is much more manifest in Holy Scripture and tradition. Is it therefore more perfect, or do you think that perfection comes from their synthesis?
Well, I think the synthesis is what is needed. There is, as I mentioned in passing, Enlightenment ethics is very deontological. They lose contact with virtue completely, and they use the word occasionally, but it's just, that's not a concern of theirs. They're not interested in, and this is particularly true of Kant, very influential ethicist. I'll talk about him later on in the series. And the result of that is that there's no interest in moral education, development of character, all those sorts of issues. And this has been a big problem with modern ethics. So there's been a reaction against this in the from the mid 20th century. And again, I'll talk about this a bit in one of the last lectures. People bringing back ethics, back virtue into ethics, and saying that it's really important. And they're right. They're right to do that, because a lot have been lost. But on the other hand, you can't run a society on the basis of virtue ethics. You've got to have rules. In fact, even Aristotle and Plato realized that, and they actually spend quite a lot of time talking about laws, which is not something which their modern followers tend to do. So you've got to have them both.
Very good. One more question. You made an interesting distinction between virtue and practical aptitudes, for example, in fatherhood. Could you expand on this, please?
Yes. So the way I think of Aristotelian virtues is that they include three elements. To have a virtue implies that you know what to do, that you know how to do it, and that you want to do it. So there's a desire. So in the most obvious sense, it's a disposition to do something. The disposition to do something means that you recognize what it is that you're supposed to be doing, and that you have the skill. So there's a very close analogy between the moral virtues and ordinary skills, which we wouldn't describe as virtues, such as being able to farm or something like that. Skills which are connected with the moral life, I mean, they are, they're very close to being virtues, or perhaps they are virtues. So there's a very close relationship between those things, because you can have a skill without wanting to use it, and that's one thing that makes it different from a virtue.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, that's all the questions answered. Thank you once again, Dr. Shaw. Thank you to everybody for taking part today. And the video of this lesson, as with the other lessons, will be made available on the Family and Life Academy website, along with study notes for you to download and other resources. We look forward to seeing you for lesson 4, which is entitled Human Law. And we are looking out and do look out for other courses available at the Family and Life Academy. Thank you again, Dr. Shaw, and to everybody until next.